Welcome to the Financial Sandbox. Finance can be messy, but we clean it up with facts, fun, and a little sarcasm here and there. So let's get into it. Today, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm looking out at Nissan Stadium and the river. And I'd love to show you guys this, but there's too much light and I'd look weird. So I'm at a conference at a convention here in Nashville. And with us today on the show is Mike Hollister from NexPoint. And Mike has a really interesting background. He's not only a CPA, but he is the man of the hour today. And I want you to tell a little about us, a little of your background, and then introduce us to NexPoint. Hey, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Herb. I'm happy to be here and, give people a little bit of some of the insights into, into navigating some of these real estate investments. We've worked together for years now, so it's been great. I've been with NexPoint for about 10 years. We manage about $30 billion, and about half of that is invested in, various asset classes in real estate. Where we focused, we manage, a bunch of single family rentals, a bunch of multifamily, about 25,000 units of each, another 80,000 self-storage units. And then we've recently made some big investments into the specialty manufacturing space, something like that we'll be talking about today. But that's been my experience with NexPoint. I've served as a financial advisor and and also as a CPA, as you mentioned. That's how I got started in this industry. But doing this side of thing, working with financial advisors for the last 20 years or so.
So you've been at NexPoint for a number of years. Tell me a little about NexPoint, and in this industry, people do stay in jobs. It's not like Silicon Valley where people are switching jobs every 2 years. You've been there for a long time. What's kept you there?
It's interesting. One of the things that I like, is, so I'm working with financial advisors. So I'm not the one who actually comes up with the products. I'm not the one who analyzes the market and decides, okay, how do we skate where the puck is going, not just kind of, reacting in the moment. And those people that are making those decisions, like if they're in a room and I walk in there, the average IQ probably goes down like 20 points. They're really smart. And I'll tell you what, Herb, over the last, 10 years, they've made me look pretty good. They've enhanced my relationships. Sometimes they've done some things that makes me, scratch my head a little bit. But more often than not, they've been proven right. And so, I really like working with smart people that are not just looking to figure out, well, they're not sticking a finger in the air and and just like, where's everything going? Let's just go that way. No, they're blazing trails and actually saying, look, the market needs this. Mike, you got to get good. You got to tell some stories because the market, may be a little bit resistant to this story, but this is what the market needs for right now. And more often than not, they've been right.
And you guys have you guys stay in your lane. There's a couple of lanes. You don't really vary much from them, right?
Our first, we work with, Delaware Statutory Trusts, and I think our first 15, 16 programs were all multifamily because that was where our focus was, and from 2010 or 2011, 12, up till 2022 or so, it was a great asset class to be in. There were, you had low interest rates, you had no headwinds. I mean, really the only way you lost investing in multifamily was to just not be in it. It was a very good time for multifamily. But then when interest rates, all of a sudden we experienced the biggest rate hike in the history of the world, and the entire real estate market changed. And so rather than just saying, well, this is what we're good at, we've done it. Managing 25,000 units, that's more than most of our competitors in the space. We did actually pivot. We pivoted to another area of expertise, thinking that this is something I think this is an area where we can bring something unique to the market and maybe even shift people's focus and attention away from kind of what they've always done.
Mm-hmm. And so was that when you guys started in the self-storage space? And
self-storage was Yeah, self-storage was something. I mean, we've done like 6 of those programs. So really, in April of 2020, we bought a massive self-storage company. It was a private company. It was a public company at the time, and we took it private in a transaction. And so, if you think back to April of 2020, boy, that was a good time to be buying really anything,
Yeah.
much less a strong self-storage company. And then all of a sudden, through COVID, everybody was having to hollow out, their spare bedroom to create a home office, and so everybody was renting storage units. And I think storage revenues went up like something 30-40% that year. So it was great, and then, they reverted, they came back a little bit. But yeah, storage has been a major area of emphasis for us. I think we manage about 80,000 storage units. But I would say that storage and multifamily are very similar. Okay. In both cases, you're renting, you have one complex, you have one big apartment complex, you might have 300 or 400 rooms. Storage, you've got, 800, 900 rooms, or, storage, little facilities. Now,
Right.
Storage is designed for turnover. If people are in there 4 months, 5 months, 3 months, and then they leave, you don't have to repaint, you just sweep it out and then they're back in. So, you can actually have someone leave, re-rent that room. Yeah. Raise the rent, but they're very similar. Multi-tenants, constant turnover, and the ability to keep up with inflation and to continue to raise rents as the markets support those rents being raised. But one of the things that we saw from 2020, in 21 and 22, remember when interest rates were very low, is we saw a lot of building in both storage and multifamily. Rates were so low that we were in a housing shortage. We still had 5, 6, 7 million homes in terms of a shortage. A lot of activity because it was cheap. It was other people's money, had never been cheaper. And so we had massive overbuilding in a lot of the areas where you want to own a storage, bigger, larger urban areas. That's where you want to have storage. That's where you want to have apartments. That's where the jobs are going to be. And so we saw coming out of 2022, when the rates were higher, all of a sudden, there were these developers, who like all of a sudden they needed to exit their properties because they were going to start paying a much higher interest rate. And so then they had to exit. And what happens when a developer needs to exit their property a little quicker? What do? Well, they offer concessions, and they offer you the ability. It's like, hey, we'll give you, you pay for 12 months, we'll give you it for the price of 9. And what does that mean? Well, now everybody else has to compete with those concessions, and you see rental rates start to fall just because of all the competition. Right. And we experienced that. And so when we saw that coming, we pivoted and we said, we love this kind of investment. We love multifamily, we love storage, but they share something in common. And that's both of them, you get paid last. Okay. You get paid less. Those are, as a real estate investor, yeah, you're a landlord, and you think, well, landlord, I'm passive. No, not really. Your apartment complex, your storage complex, these are businesses. Yep. And at the end of the day, you got to pay taxes, you got to pay insurance, you got to pay upkeep, you got to pay all those things. And then what is left over at the end of the day, that's your paycheck. That's what you actually get from that money. And so if the market says, property taxes are high, remember coming off 2022, all-time high values, people in 23, 24 were paying massive amounts of property taxes and seeing increases. We had, insurance issues, you had California wildfires, you had hurricanes in Florida. I mean, you always have those things, but, they seem to be, particularly egregious going after people. That caused insurance rates to spike, and everybody was paying, 30% increases in insurance year over year, massive increases in insurance costs. And so all those things cut into your paycheck. Sure. And so what we did is we pivoted. We saw a couple things, during COVID, we saw an emphasis that the government was making. And if you can align your interests with the interests of government, that generally works out well for you. And so we saw the government coming in and saying, we want to emphasize more domestic manufacturing. And we want to do this in areas, particularly healthcare, biotechnology, and and technology. And so what we ended up doing is we bought for about $200 million a semiconductor manufacturing plant in California with a brand new tenant. Okay. And then we bought, a life science, a manufacturer of pills and powders in Pittsburgh, and a manufacturer of drug, injector, like needles and things like that, drug delivery mechanisms up in Minnesota. And so these are all factories. They're U.S. based factories, and the tenant, you evaluate the tenant because that's really strong. But here's the difference. Rather than caring what happens in all the business and needing that tenant to actually turn a profit, well, now we're truly a landlord, and they're payment is based on a lease, whether it's 15 years or 20 years, they have a long-term lease. And so as a real estate investor, particularly someone in your capacity who's, building portfolios of passive investments, joining them together, you have the ability to invest in both things that get paid last and things based on leases where the investor gets paid first.
Right.
Like, so I'll back up on this a little bit, and I'll explain, unpack this a little bit more, because when you've got, when you've got these your apartment complex and things like that, you're running along, and when you're developing a private investment portfolio, it's not like these things have a stock price, right? You can't look it up and see what they're worth. You really only figure out what they're worth when you go to sell them.
When you go to
right?
sell.
So there's no. Yeah, you go to sell them, then you figure out what they're worth. And so that's different than owning Microsoft stock. When you have Microsoft stock and the market, starts to go down, you see your stock go down. But, okay, you see your value go down in your account, and, that's unsettling. But, you're a long-term investor. You talk yourself into it. Well, with real estate, when you see market difficulties, who knows what the value is? You're not trying to sell it. Doesn't really matter.
Right.
But you feel the effect of that market downturn in your paycheck, in your income. And a lot of people, if you're building portfolios, they say, look, I need consistency. I like the idea that it can keep up with inflation, but I'm at a place in my life right now, whether it's maybe my needs are pretty tight, and the amount of real estate that I have to generate an income, a check for me, I need to be very careful. A lot of people don't have a lot of extra money, and so they're looking to really build in something predictable and reliable. And what you can do is you can say, look, I want part of my income tied to a 20-year lease with automatic rent bumps, so that I have a pretty good idea. I can know what my check's going to be next month. I can know what it's going to be a year and a half from now, 3 years from now. I can plan and know what that's going to look like, what that income stream is going to look like. And I don't necessarily have to wonder, well, what if the economy does this? What if what if taxes go up? What if insurance costs go up? Will that cut into my check? I don't have to think about it, because that company that leased, that building that we own, as long as they're in business, the very first check they write is their rent check. And from that rent check, the investor gets that income.
Right. So I'm going to back up here a little bit, because the space that I work in 1031 exchange, I work with a lot of clients who might have no debt on their current property they own. In fact, I have a client who owns 2 apartment buildings, and they're in the Bay Area, so their value's high, and they have no debt on it. And they're looking at planning retirement, but they're worried about taxes. And they also, having all of that income just come in. What's the difference when someone might be looking at, let's say, a Delaware Statutory Trust option, the like-kind replacement option in a 1031 exchange, and they say, oh, I should also get a Delaware Statutory Trust with 0 debt. Why would I consider 30% debt? What would be the benefits and advantages or disadvantages to considering those options?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And a lot of people, when they have no debt on a property, they say, I should just continue to go with no debt on the property. Like, some of them, are driven by kind of a Dave Ramsey affiliation. They're just like, oh, debt is bad. Any kind of debt is bad. And then they forget, that the debt that they used initially a long time ago was what helped them build, their real estate fortune. So I will say this: the idea of using some of other people's money along with your own money, it's not a simple calculation of nope, debt is bad. Now, in one sense, debt can be bad during times of economic uncertainty, or times when when you have a lack of confidence in what can happen, is how reliable that income stream is going to be. Because that, when you do have debt on a property, that means that the bank needs to get paid before you get paid. So they get paid first, you get paid second. Okay. And so you got to think about those things. And if you're now, if it's a triple net lease or something like that, then you have a lot of confidence that you're going to get paid. But anytime you're saying the bank needs to get paid before you get anything, when there's a downturn, well, the bank's going to get their money, and maybe you don't get all of yours. And I can see that. Some people might say, you know what, I'm nervous about that, because that represents a catastrophic failure. And I don't want to experience catastrophic failure. But other people, And I think this is, you're more likely to, to evaluate all concerns. And one of the major concerns about whether to add debt to a property when you're exiting a property with zero debt is, well, how much taxes do you want to pay?
Right.
Because that is the key thing. Because when you've held a piece of property for a long time, you have no debt. Usually that means you have no basis left over. You've fully depreciated it. Basically, when you get something and you've owned it for a long time, you've depreciated it over its useful life. And maybe you just have the land value because you can't depreciate the land. So maybe you just have the land value left over. And now when you're going into a new property, you can take that land and you can do what's called a simplified basis, where you now take that land value and divide it by the ratio in the new property that you're acquiring. But what you don't get is more basis. The only way to get more basis is to actually accumulate more real estate. And the only way to do that typically is, well, you write a check or you use debt, use some other people's money. And what that does is it creates additional basis, which creates additional opportunities for you to have a write-off, because it's not just about how much money you make, it's how much money of that you get to keep after you pay the tax man. So for example, on one of our, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to take a step back here, because sometimes people don't understand basis. What is basis? Mm-hmm. Can you explain basis?
Yeah, basis. So when you have a piece of of equipment or any kind of large property, it's the same thing if you're a business owner, whether it's a truck or whether it's real estate. It's basically what you paid for something. Okay, and when the case of an income capital producing asset, generally speaking, the government wants you to write the cost of that asset off over its useful life. You don't get to just buy a rental house for $500,000 and then write off $500,000 because you wrote the check. I spent that money, it's gone. No, it doesn't work that way. Well, one of the reasons is typically you don't spend all your money, you use some of your money and some of other people's money, and you could generate massive write-offs if you could just call that as an expense. Like if you have a plane ticket for your business, that's an expense. Okay, but if you buy an asset that's an income producing asset, like a piece of real estate, that's a capital asset, and you need to write it off over time. And they do that through depreciation. Depreciation is the idea that, we're going to write this off, we're going to write this down and create an expense over its estimated useful life. And as you write it off, the basis, meaning how much you paid for it, gets lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. And so here's an interesting thing. When you sell some real estate, you're like, well, I paid $400,000 for this real estate. Now it's worth $1 million. Okay. And so people will say like, oh, okay, that means I'm going to have a $600,000 profit because I paid 400. Now it's worth $1 million. However, during the last 20 years of ownership, you wrote off that entire $400,000, or maybe you wrote off 350,000 of it. There was some land that you couldn't. Right. And so now, no. It's not $600,000. It's $600,000 plus the $350,000 depreciation, that basis that you initially had, because you just say you went in with all cash. Now you've written all that off. And so you need to recapture all that. So not only do you have a massive gain, but you have another similar tax bill from depreciation recapture that's valued at 25, that you're going to get taxed probably at 25%, which is better than ordinary income rates, but still it's a significant component of that tax bill. And so that's what basis works, and it generates the need to do a 1031 exchange.
And there's two kinds of basis, right? There's residential, multifamily, there's industrial, commercial property. They have two different timelines on that basis, right? On the depreciation.
Yep, 27.5 years for residential or 39 years for commercial. So for example, our storage properties, 39-year life and depreciation. Residential properties, you get a little bit more depreciation just because, they're made of wood, I don't know. The IRS sets the rules. However, there's a little thing you can do to accelerate that depreciation. We're talking about, there's a lot of stuff on the news about the tax bill and depreciation and accelerated depreciation. People have probably heard of that, Section 179 depreciation or bonus depreciation. Like there are a lot of tax incentives that are created to like, hey, get people to buy a new truck, get people to buy new equipment. We'll let them write it off earlier. Well, one of the things you can do with your investments is you can do something called a cost segregation study. Like, for example, we have a $200 million facility. They build semiconductors in this facility, $200 million. And it's all 39 years if you do straight line depreciation. However, within that, there's a lot of different stuff. Like there's chairs, there's desks, there's computers, there's different tools and stuff. There's all different kinds of stuff. Well, some of that is rated at 5-year life. Some of that is rated at 7-year life, and some of that is rated at a 15-year life. And so if you do a study and actually allocate which things in that building are actually 5, 7, and 15-year life, then you can take a big chunk of that and accelerate the depreciation. Okay, and you can write that off. And if someone is a real estate professional, they can actually use that deduction against ordinary income. For most people who are passive real estate investors, that's going to be, they're going to be able to use that to offset any kind of passive income. Most importantly, if you're building a Delaware Statutory Trust portfolio, you're going to generate a lot of passive income. And if you have some debt on the portfolio, and you have a new basis that came in as a result of that debt, and you have the benefit of a cost segregation study, you got to think like, well, for a DST, you're going to hopefully be an owner, maybe 4 to 7 years. Well, now you've got 5-year and 7-year depreciation that you'll be able to accelerate how fast you can write that off. And in many cases, I know this is something that we seek to do, is we seek to create a level of debt that will make, for most investors, that income fully tax deferred. So again, at the end of the year, it's not just the number, how much you were paid. It's how much you were paid, including how much of it the IRS lets you keep. And one of the ways to maximize that number is the intelligent use of debt. Now, we've gone over it pretty fast, and we've thrown a lot of big words. But the key here is like, look, even if you're looking at, paying a lot of taxes, you've got to have an evaluation. Should you, is this property, does it have a cost segregation study on it? Are you going to be able to, is the leverage appropriate relative to the cash flow? Is it big enough to shelter the cash flow with the existence of a cost segregation study? These are things that it's why it's important to use a good advisor.
So in the example of that $200 million property, it's not just the $5.1 million deduction that you're getting over 39 years every year. There's more to it, and it's a little more complicated than that. And next time, what we'll do is we'll have a PowerPoint presentation so we can go item by item so someone can see it and do that. But it's great to have this overview, because a lot of times I talk to people who say, oh, I don't want to have any debt. Right? And all I want to do is find an option with no debt, because then I don't have to worry about it. And my conversation is, where are you getting any depreciation and tax shelter on that income? And that's where what you're talking about really comes in handy. And sometimes it's good to take part of your 1031 exchange and maybe split it up into a portion where you're getting 20 or 30% LTV, loan to value, on that portfolio, is what we're talking about here.
It's something also to keep in mind, is that anytime you exit a property, you have to at least replace the debt. So debt is something, once you do it, you got to go either the same or higher when you come out of the future. So if you've got a property in zero debt, you can buy, it's like the blood, where the universal, like, you can go anywhere. You can do anything. You can buy debt, or you can do no debt. But once you have debt, when that sells, you're going to have to at least replace the debt. And so some people would say like, oh, okay, maybe I don't want to go into something with 55% debt, because I'm going to have to replace that. And that limits my choices. If you can choose from zero debt or additional debt and anything in between, then that investor has a myriad choices. They can go a bunch of different ways. They can actually build a very broadly diversified portfolio. Where if someone's coming out of something and they have a substantial amount of debt, it can limit their choices. So that's another reason, thinking down the road. But typically, most people will just say, look, I don't want debt. It just makes me nervous. I think that it's important to educate them on the benefits, on the tax benefits, because for most people who invest in it, who do 1031 exchanges, the goal is to 1031 exchange forever, so that ultimately their kids get a stepped up basis. And so if you can take some of that income received through the addition of debt and make that income tax deferred, we always say as financial advisors, it's tax deferred. But really, if your intention and your ability to and you can execute holding that kind of, we call it swap till you drop, if you can actually and have your kids inherit that stepped up basis, poof, those taxes were never paid. You turned a tax deferral into tax free, and that's an incredible advantage. Those are real savings. I know that sometimes a lot of financial advisors are uncomfortable talking about taxes. Well, that's a tax issue. We're going to talk about mutual funds, or we're going to talk about this. Well, with real estate transactions, you've got to be willing to talk about taxes. You've got to have a strong basis of knowledge. Now, listen, Herb's not going to sign your return. So anyway, but yeah, getting back to this, it's important to talk about tax savings because those savings are permanent. Anytime you're dealing with tax savings, those are, you didn't get those just because you took a little extra risk and chose the right stock. You bought NVIDIA before everybody knew, and it's nothing like that. No, those tax savings are real and permanent, and can make a huge difference over the long run. They need to be given adequate consideration when you're building a real estate portfolio, especially a passive one.
You talked about the stepped up basis.
Yeah.
When someone passes on, is that the same in the Delaware Statutory Trust? Obviously, I know the answer to this, but people ask me all the time, well, how does that happen when my kids might inherit the Delaware Statutory Trust? Is it the same as when they inherit my real estate?
Yeah, it's as if you had appreciated stock. It's the same. If you have appreciated real estate, if you have an appreciated Delaware Statutory Trust, yes, upon the date of your passing, your heirs will get a stepped up basis for any type, even stock. Like I said, it's not even just real estate, but it certainly is a Delaware Statutory Trust. Now, one of the things that makes it easy is like, well, say you have 3 heirs. Well, you just take that the Delaware Statutory Trust, you divide it into 3 pieces, and each person gets their own piece. And now they can make their own choices with that when it actually sells and turns over. And so in many ways, it's a lot easier to divide a DST than a rental house. Right. Rental house, well, you're going to sell it and you're going to, figure that out, and you're going to maybe fire sell it because you got to do it quick. Well, no, DSTs, you just straighten it up down the middle. It's just a piece of paper at that point. It'd be very, very friendly for estate planning purposes.
It's the same conversation I have with clients all the time. You own 3 apartment buildings and you have 2 children. One apartment building is great. The other one's okay, but there's a dog that just doesn't hunt. And the question is, which child are you going to give that building to? And that's where we really have that conversation about the opportunity to sell now, move the money into an opportunity like a Delaware Statutory Trust, and have that income so that down the road, at their passing, it splits according to the terms of the trust to their heirs. So yeah, that's always a hard conversation, but it's a conversation that I definitely have with my clients.
Yeah, super important. This is, a lot of people will get to a point with their real estate when they just want to retire from being a landlord. They've done it. They're no longer trying to get rich. Maybe they're trying to stay rich. They're just trying to figure it out. They're trying to simplify their life, and they've recognized that, they're not going to live long enough to replace all this. So they've got to get more serious about risk and, more serious about just not wasting, their golden years managing their properties. And so they enlist the help of an advisor to build a portfolio of DSTs because they sure as heck ain't going to pay any taxes. And so you want to not pay taxes, but you want to step out and that, I could rent, I could go buy an Applebee's or something, but now you really want a diversified portfolio and, so that you can weather any kind of financial storm and not put all your eggs into one basket. Again, you're not trying to get rich, you're trying to stay rich. And I just don't think there's a better solution for a real estate investor in that stage of life than the Delaware Statutory Trust.
So let's talk personal. Where do you live now?
So I'm up in Bellingham, Washington. So close to Canada. Yeah.
And you also lived in Coeur d'Alene for a while, and then you came back to Bellingham, and you have a number of children. This is where I get into my funny questions at the end of the interview. All right. So.
All right. Fair enough.
This is the boxers or briefs questions, right? So, so how many children do you have?
So I have six. I'll tell you, Herb, it's interesting. I've been doing this, like I said, 20 years. And when I started, I think I had like three. And I'd work with financial advisors like yourself, often quite older than and they're like, oh, you got three kids. That's good. And they said, I wish I had had one more. And then, so we kind of just kept on having one more and just have one more. And then and I'll tell you, then finally, we got six and we were starting to fill up vehicles and life was starting to get complicated. But I will say, even down the road six, it's like, and my youngest now is 13. Man, tell you, but I kind of wish I would have had one more. So, but, I should have some grandkids coming reasonably soon. My 22-year-old just got engaged and they're looking to get married here pretty quick. So awesome. I'm hoping that I've timed it so that I've got we're not empty nesters yet. Got a few more years, got, 5 years or so, 6 years, somewhere around there. And, right. I should have grandkids in by the time all the nest is empty. So,
all right. So my questions go this way. Simpsons or All American Dad?
Oh man, The Simpsons. I got to go with The Simpsons. I've been, it's part of my youth. It's still running strong. I mean, yeah, I all the respect. Yeah.
Yeah. Saturday Night Live, maybe, or is that
Saturday Night Live? I like old school. I mean, you give me some Farley and Sandler, you give me those days, there's some good moments now. I like when Nate Bargatze goes on. I think he's great. I think he's hilarious. So they have some moments right now. It's like, I feel like, you give me a clip. I've got like 3 or 4 good ones, but you give me, you go back to the Farley and Sandler days. Oh man, that's some of the best stuff. So,
all right.
Farrell in his prime. Yeah.
Marvel or DC? Which means Fantastic Four and Spider-Man.
Oh yeah, no,
and Wonder Woman.
I'm definitely going to go Marvel. I think that all of the movies over the last several movies have been a little bit disappointing. I was actually telling my kids this, because they see a Marvel movie, you get Avengers, and like literally every movie star is in the movie. Back when I was growing up, you had Stallone or Schwarzenegger, not both. I remember when the movie Heat came out and you had Pacino and De Niro in the same movie, how big of a deal that was, okay, to have 2 big stars. And it's like, and now they just pack every movie star into every movie, right. So it's an entirely different world. But yeah, no, I'm definitely going to go with Marvel. They've created a great universe, although I don't know, we'll see what happens kind of going forward. It's, they're struggling a little bit to find their footing.
Does that mean that you were also a comic book guy?
No, never was. Never, no. Not too much of a comic book guy. Never really got into that. My exposure to Iron Man was like when Robert Downey Jr. Put on the mask. That was,
Hey, that's a wrap. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more raw financial talk in the Sandbox. Mike, thanks so much for joining me while I'm in Nashville here, and this is the first time I've done a live show off out of my office. So this has been great. I think I'm gonna have to travel more so I can do more like it. So
all right.
Thanks a lot, man.
Sounds good. Thanks, Herb.
All right. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Yep. Take care, man.